Here we go. All right, so our goals for today, we're going to continue to talk about rubrics. We started that last time, and we'll continue to talk about that. And then there were a couple of questions that came up on the feedback form that you filled out at the end of session 3. We had quite a few more people fill it out, so thank you for taking the time to do that. We do read every word that you type and consider that in our development of the next session. So appreciate your feedback, appreciate your questions. It kind of helps us frame where we're headed for the next one. We're going to look at our homework reading and think about that together. And then we will, hopefully you brought a rubric with you and your experience with it in order for us to engage in our problem of practice today. All right, so here we are on our timeline. You see the star there is on November and December. So again, this is our second session about rubrics. And then our January, February sessions will be all about motivating students, all about motivation. Then we'll go into multiple opportunities, and then we'll finish out the year shifting the grading paradigm. What does that look like to shift it in my department or in my team or in my school, etc. All right, Andrea, I am not looking at the chat. So if you can you keep an eye on that and then let me know if there's something we need to pause and talk about?
No, that's great. And I have been dropping in links for the attendance and for the
Awesome.
slides for anybody as well.
That's probably why I see a 5 there. Okay. All right. So again, rubrics recap, debrief the homework. Whoa. I do not know what just happened there. Hang on. Oh my God. What are you guys seeing right now? Oh, I can't hear you, Andrea.
We're just like a background of like a screen, as though you moved the presentation to another.
Oh, there it is.
There we go.
Okay.
Yeah.
My mouse is so sensitive that if I look at it, it does some weird thing. So, okay. Sorry about that, you guys. Okay, we have the same norms, and we're doing great with those. I feel like there's a lot of respect in the room about listening to each other and learning from each other. So I really appreciate your commitment to that and just showing up as an engaged learner, which is, all that we can ask. So thank you for that. Appreciate your attention and commitment to that. All right, so let's look at some of your questions. So one of the questions, if your district uses points, how do you use rubrics and make that work with points, right? And it's hard. I will say that it's hard because they're different things. They're different systems, and they don't connect very well together. So that's why I said this is tricky. So a rubric score, a rubric mark, a rubric description, it's not meant to be directly convertible. In fact, like a 4, 3, 2, 1 on a rubric, those are not grades. Those are symbols that represent a description of learning. So you don't have to put 4, 3, 2, 1. You could put heart, star, triangle, square, right? It's a symbol that represents a level of understanding in the evidence that you're viewing. So when you try to take the symbol of evidence of understanding and then try to convert that to a percentage, like it's not a smooth and easy thing. Also, because a points system is 101 degrees of proficiency, if you think about it. So like, what's the difference between a 64 and a 67 in terms of their understanding? Well, that's really hard to articulate, right? And that's why a point system is not the same thing. Like it's not it's not communicating the same information. So one way that people have tried to make this work is, you'll see these boxes right here. So here's like a 4, 3.5, 3. So imagine these as indicators, proficiency indicators on a rubric. And they've tried to convert that over to a percentage, and even a percentage that has like plus and minus. So a 4 might be the A plus, and a 3.5 might be the A minus. If you're if your district goes even further and does pluses and minuses. But notice that the 1, this is a 59, right? So we're not going all the way down to a 0, because between 0 and 59, there's many degrees of understanding there. And to call that all a 0, like, that's not very fair, is it? Right? Like 59 ways to call it a 0. But if you have a 57, you have some level of understanding there, right? There's some information that's been put on the test that you have warranted as a 57, and that's not equivalent to a 0, right? So that's why it's hard trying to match up a point scale with a rubric, proficiency indicators. It's very difficult to do. Something that we tried for a while at our school is this idea of a grade matrix. So let me show you what that means.
Before you move
So,
on, I just want to say that at our school, we do kind of have that same box of what you showed a minute ago of, hey, we're giving people a 4, 3, 2, 1. And the consequence of having a 1 be 59% is that you hear conversations from students a lot saying, well, I'm almost there. I have a 59%. I'm like, yeah, you have a 1, you turn something in, but it seems more attainable that they can actually pass than if they have a 0%. And just wanted to throw that in there. Go ahead. Sorry, Christy.
oh no, I'm glad you did. That's a good perspective. We haven't used points in my district in a long, long time. So even me trying to kind of talk about how to relate it to points is a challenge area for me. So I
Yeah, we
appreciate chiming
actually
in.
say like, hey, a 4 is 95%. And so anytime it enters it, it automatically puts it into our, so we do like a 4, 3, 2, 1, or we do an ABC F, or ABC non-pass. And in that case, it puts in a percentage number that's a set fixed percentage that's in the middle of the grade band of what we would want to be an ABC. So it's like, hey, if you got a 4, then we're saying that's an A and that's a 95% or a 99. So it's the same sort of idea. I think our numbers are slightly different.
I really love this idea of a grading matrix, because it's taking those proficiency levels, 4, 3, 2, 1, and it's talking about it. If you have this collection of these proficiency levels, that translates to this letter grade. So notice there's no math. We're not doing any averaging or mathing at all. To convert. We're just saying, hey, if you have 5 marks, and 3 of them are 4s, and you don't have any 1s or 2s, then that's an A for the course. That means you're mastering more than half of them, right? 3 out of 5, you have 4s, and then if there's no scores of 1s or 2s, then the other 2 must be 3s. So you have 4s and 3s, more 4s than 3s. That translates to an A for the course. And then, then there's variation as we move down. So a B is 4 of the 5 learning target scores have to be 3s and 4s, no scores of 1. So you might have a 2 in there, right? Etc. So this is a great way. We started our standards-based model in the district using a matrix, and then the superintendent decided to change it because he felt like parents were not understanding. They could understand an average, they could get behind an average, but the matrix was, I guess, confusing, and so we changed the way we did it, which was a big bummer. I hope that we go back to this model because I do really like it.
I
But
also think that one of the problems I heard about the original Matrix was that it was a little too harsh and it was not very forgiving. And so they wanted to make it a little bit more forgiving, and rather than make small tweaks to the matrix, they just threw all the baby out with the bathwater and said, let's do an average. But we have tried to think about how we might tweak the matrix that's in our synergy, but changes in leadership have made it difficult for us as well. So I think we're kind of in that same boat because you kind of have to play around with it for a bit to get to the right matrix. Go ahead, Christy.
Yeah. All right. So let's see if we can get back here. Yep. Okay. So anyway, any lingering questions about points and rubrics and converting between them? Let me know if something shows up in the chat. All right. Where are we here? Sorry. Okay. So there was a question also about, we talked last time about making a rubric general enough so that you could use it in multiple scenarios, but also specific enough that kids are actually getting usable feedback, right? So here's an example of a really general rubric. I don't love this one. And I was wondering if you guys could pick it apart for me a little bit in the chat. Like, what's something that sticks out about this rubric that maybe is not great? I'm going to open my chat so I can read it. What do you think? What's something about this that is maybe not great? This one's super general, super general. Almost always and most of the time could be the same, right?
And I guarantee that my almost always and a student's most of the time are the same. Well, I think it's most of the time and they think it's almost always.
Right. This rubric is relying on frequency. So it's about how often the student is doing it, not about necessarily the quality of what they're doing, right? Doesn't define what motor skill competency is. It also doesn't define what a physically literate individual is. Like, this is not helpful for a student. It's not giving feedback on how the student can improve. It's just talking about, well, if you do it more often, that's better. Well, do what more often? And what's the quality of what I'm doing more often, right? So I think one I guess piece of feedback I would give about writing rubrics is to try to steer away from frequency. That's a place that people want to go often when they're writing a rubric because it's an easy entry. It's an easy place to start. Well, they have to get 6 out of 10. 6 out of 10 times they have to do it right. Instead, describe what doing it right looks like. Like, when you're looking at student evidence, literally what will you be seeing, reading, listening to, whatever, that will tell you that they are proficient, like they understand it, they're meeting the target. Or if they're not quite there, what will that evidence look like, literally? All right, so this is very, very general. And then we can get a little bit more specific. So now you'll notice, again, this is another PE example, but we have ALT2. We have demonstrate the understanding of movement concepts, principles, and strategies during an invasion game. So already right off the bat, we're more specific. The previous one is called, the learning target is physical skills, and then psychomotor, whatever that means, right? Physical skills, I know that's moving, but is there anything in particular, any particular physical skills, right? Or just in general, anything? I mean, that's very, like I said, very general. So we're getting a little bit more specific here. We're talking about invasion games, and then we're looking at concepts, principles, and strategies. So then you'll notice the descriptions are getting a little bit more specific. Consistently transitions from offense to defense quickly while communicating with teammates. Reduces open space on the defense by marking and staying close to the opponent during a game. Like, they're describing what they're going to be seeing to know if the student understands a strategy for defense during a game. Right? So that's giving more specific feedback to the student or whoever's looking at the rubric. Okay, to improve, this is what my student needs to do. Right? It's a lot clearer. All right. Now, to make a connection here, someone was also asking in the comments, like, how do we go from evaluating to something on the report card? Like, what's the pathway there? So imagine here that I'm grading something called a one pager. So this is like an on-demand something that I'm asking students to write. And the learning target that I'm looking at demonstrates an appreciation of literary features. So I evaluate the student work and I see that they are able to identify literary features. But actually the analysis, which is maybe a little bit more meaty, the analysis of its effect on multiple things is a 3. So in my team, we've discussed this and we agree that the analysis piece is a little bit meatier and, maybe has a little bit more impact on the overall level of proficiency chosen. So although they can ID something at a 4, they can't analyze it at a 4. So the overall mark is a 3, which goes in the grade book as a 3. I've got 4 things in the grade book right here. And depending on how I have chosen in my grade book, I may be averaging these 4 things and coming up with an overall learning target score. And that is what's printed on the report card. So you'll see there's the demonstrates an appreciation of literary features. That's the learning target. And in the first quarter, there was a 3, and then it turns out in the second quarter, there was also a 3. But that's what this 3 represents, is the overall indicator of understanding, like from a rubric scale, for literary features. So that's kind of that connection between rubric, assignment, rubric, gradebook, and report card. All right. Okay, another thing that I see a lot is sometimes people make a checklist and then call that a rubric, right? So I just want to call out kind of the difference between these two. So a checklist has literally, these are the items that I'm expecting to see on the student submission. So excuse me, they're going to have on their data table, they're going to have column titles, uncertainties, et cetera, et cetera. You'll notice this is from a physics. And if I click on this, we'll see the whole thing. And it's actually a pretty comprehensive checklist. So data table, graph, claim, evidence, mathematical model, prediction, justification, limitations, extension. So these are all these checkboxes. These are things that I'm expecting to see in their lab. But when I evaluate the quality of those things, I'm going to look at the rubric. The rubric is the description of quality. The checklist is just what are the items that need to be included. So sometimes when I see a rubric that really is just a checklist, my question back is like, okay, what if I do all of these things? Does that mean I get a 4? Because that's what it says in your 4 box. I've done all of these things. However, I didn't do a very good job on all of these things. And I misspoke and some parts are incorrect, but I did them all, right? And according to what you've indicated in your rubric, that's a 4. And so therein lies the problem, right? That they're sort of conflating those two ideas. So the checklist is a separate document, and actually attached to the rubric is awesome for the kid, right? On one side is the checklist, on the other side is the rubric, and I've got all the things I need to know all on one sheet. The checklist is literally the things I need to include, and then the rubric is the quality of those things, the description of the quality. All right. So again, rubrics define the features of work that constitute the quality, and it helps the teacher clarify what they're looking for, like literally what they're looking for in the evidence, and what that looks like over the different levels of proficiency. What does it look like at a 2 level versus what does it look like at a 4 level? That's useful for kids. It's useful for teachers when they're grading. It's useful for parents or any support staff who are supporting the kids. Everyone knows what's going on. Everyone understands what the progression is, right? And that's a lot less questions that you have to answer, a lot less conversations that you have to have about how to improve. It's literally all documented already on the rubric, right? So that's a great reason to have a rubric. There are many great reasons to have a rubric, but that's one reason. Now, what kind of rubric you want to use? Well, you can really geek out here on rubrics. There's several kinds of rubrics. I've listed some here: task specific, general, holistic, analytic. And if you write your own rubric and you want to evaluate your own rubric, you can use a rubric for rubrics. You can use a rubric to evaluate your own rubric. I mean, I'm not even making this up. This is like, you can really nerd out on this stuff. So there's books written about different kinds of rubrics. And I have linked at least one in the resources section, and that's where this rubric for rubrics came from. So rather than, look at all these words, I want to show you some examples. Before we look at the examples, one of the last questions is like, how do I adjust my rubric for meeting my different groups of students? So for example, if I have SPED or ELL, like how do I do that? This is a great resource, grading exceptional and struggling learners. So lots of good strategies and ideas in this book. Again, I linked it in the resources. But you have a lot of room here with your, especially with your highly impacted students. So I'm thinking of students who are on a modified curriculum in your course, or maybe even a modified diploma. Here's some ways that you can do that. They list this in the book, but at least in my district, this is not something that I can evaluate in the grade book. This is for the case manager to do. They have their IEP goals, and the case manager may have a conversation with you to get some observational evidence, but it's nothing that I can do in the grade book, right? But these are things that I can do. I can look at the student's improvement over time, which is what we do anyway on rubrics, right? We look at how they've improved over time. We can also, on the previous screen, when I had an example of a literary features, and we thought the analysis was more impactful than just being able to identify. Maybe my heavily impacted student, it's a win if they can identify. So I'm going to call that one the meatiest one. Like that's my biggest indicator. And maybe that means they have a 4 on that, right? You can adjust your scale. You can adjust your descriptions for a rubric for your most impacted kids. The third bullet was a tough one for me to get my head around at first, because that is something we really don't do in our district, is make the academic grade impacted by their behavior. Like those are two separate things, right? Think back to our purpose for grading, our first couple of sessions, we talked about that a lot. But for our impacted kids, I think that's an okay thing to watch, observe, and evaluate, because that might be one of their IEP goals. Just being able, maybe being able to just engage with a group and participate. And that's 100% behavior, right? And maybe that's what I'm able to evaluate. So I think that's a great conversation to have with the case manager. And after a couple of weeks of working with the student, you kind of get a sense of like, okay, here's where they're at. And I want to see them be able to get here, right? Wherever that is, right? And so you're looking at that progress over time. We talked about modifying the grading scale. So I guess the take home message here is you have a lot of room with your modified students. Similarly with your ELL students, if you can work with the ELL specialist in your building, if you have one, or an ELL teacher, and look at, how can this student move along over time, like whether they're engaging in an academic dialogue about what you're learning, or their ability to write something. You know, what is a progression that feels doable, and then that's something that you're looking at over the course of time, right? It would be ideal if your ELL teachers had rubrics written for what they're looking for if they come in and observe. But that's a great collaboration to have with that teacher. All right. So let's look at a couple of examples. So here's that book that I referenced earlier, Creating and Recognizing Quality Rubrics. So a general rubric is just, let's see, for content understanding when the content varies. So it's general enough that I can apply it to multiple learning situations, right? It's not so specific that it just applies to this one activity. It's general enough I can apply it over lots of things. So one in science that I think of is writing a lab report, right? If I'm writing a lab report, we know that we're always going to be writing a hypothesis, for example. And I can write some general language in there about what I'm looking for in a hypothesis without getting really specific about it has to say this, or this specific content thing has to be involved. If that's true, I can't use it for multiple labs. I can just use it for one lab, right? So general enough that I can apply it to multiple things. All right, here's some more examples. So notice that these are actually two forms of a rubric that are evaluating something similar. So what I mean by that is, notice this, ideas represent a startling variety of important concepts from different contexts or disciplines. Ideas represent a startling variety of important concepts from different contexts or disciplines. So it's the same words. It's just this one is pulled out into an analytical. So analytical means we have these particular line items. So there's 4 very specific things that we're going to be evaluating here. And then it's just taking this language and parsing it out into those 4 categories. Analytics rubrics are great in science a lot because we can pull out those specific criteria that we're evaluating in an activity and say, okay, when I'm writing a lab report, I'm going to be looking for these 4 or 5 things, and I'm going to evaluate each one independently. And then I'm going to move on to the next one. I'm going to evaluate that. And it keeps it very, it's very logical sort of approach to it because it's one thing at a time, and they're not, they're not overlapping. I'm not conflating things. I'm not trying to figure out which part of the language goes with which one. This one's tougher, right? This is a holistic. This would be like for a painting. I'm looking at a painting and I'm evaluating the painting overall. I'm not picking out like individual brush strokes and color choice. Like, I'm not evaluating individual things. I'm just looking overall at the whole painting. Or like a music performance. I'm listening and watching the whole thing and doing one evaluation. Right? That's kind of holistically, I'm looking at the whole thing, versus analytically, I'm looking at these individual items. And not like picking it apart, but like focusing in on specific things about the piece of evidence. All right. Let's make sure. Oh, I knew I skipped one. Okay. So when we look at holistic and analytic, and then on the previous slide, it talked about general and task specific. So I tried to organize it a little bit so we could understand it a little bit better. So if you have a general rubric, you could have an analytic general rubric. Think like lab report. I want to apply it to multiple labs. So it's general enough that I can apply it to multiple labs. Same thing with holistic. It's general enough that I could apply it to multiple paintings, multiple music performances, multiple journal entries, whatever, right? Journaling. versus like a task specific. This is specific. This is a dumb thing to say. Specific to the task, right? Hence the title of that. It's specific to the activity that we're doing. I can't apply it to multiple things. So this is like it's a tweak on a general rubric, for example. So I could take my general lab rubric and I could put in some specific language around the content that we are learning in that lab, right? And then it becomes a task specific. So once you create these, of course, you can use them again and again. There is some front loading there. So if you're writing a task specific rubric for every big activity you're doing, which is great for kids, great for families to understand what's going on, there's some front loading of time there, right? But once you've got it written, then beyond that, it's just some small tweaks, some small adjustments, and you can continue to reuse those. So unique to a specific assignment, a specific body of knowledge, a specific activity. So which rubric works best for an activity? Well, it depends, right? Is this a kind of a one-off and I really want to focus on some specific content understanding for the student? Well, I might do a task-specific analytic. If it's just generally, I'm going to be evaluating Socratic seminar engagement, and I want to apply the same rubric every time we have a Socratic seminar, I'm going to do a general, right? So it just sort of depends what's your goal for creating one. What do you want to communicate? Okay, so in summary here's another resource that I put on the resources page. The rubrics define the quality of the items that are being included, and we try to take out any confusing terms. Like, I love this I'm just going to go back a couple of slides here. I love this confusing term right here. Ideas represent a startling variety. What does that even mean? Like amazing variety? Like so many in the variety? I'm not sure. I just love that word choice. Startling. Okay. So we try to remove any we try to remove anything that's not clear. We're trying to use really clear language to make it transparent and really obvious and straightforward about what the student needs to do. You have to practice this a lot with students, using the rubric, evaluating things, and use it for everything. Use it for your exit ticket, use it for your bell ringer, use it for your practice quiz. Anytime you're doing something in the unit and you've got a line item on the rubric for that, get that rubric out. Let's practice evaluating. You put up examples and non-examples, put the rubric next to it under the overhead, show kids how you're evaluating, what you're looking for. Show kids what a 2 example looks like. What does a 3 example look like? They need to have lots of exposure to that so that they understand what the goal is, where they're headed, and they know how to get there. Let's see, all assessments where students construct a response rather than choose a response from a list requires a scoring guide. So what I'm trying to say there is, if anytime we're doing something other than multiple choice, right? If we're having students write out an answer, if we're having them verbally describe something, if we're listening to a conversation or a presentation, like all of those need some descriptions of that evidence so the student can understand where they are in the learning progression. It's much, much harder to do that with a multiple choice. And then all decisions about which rubric you're going to use all depend on what's the purpose of it. Are we trying to use it multiple times? Are we really want to focus in on some of the content learning? We might do a task specific. So it kind of depends. But these resources are great, especially the one about writing rubrics is great. Lots of examples in that. So if you want to dig in more, you kind of nerd out on rubrics, there is ways to do that.
All right,
All
so
right.
Christy, let's give your voice a break.
Yes, thank you.
And we'll get yeah. So now we're going to go to the part where we asked you to bring a rubric in, and we're going to workshop a rubric. We're going to put you into some breakout rooms. Once you go there, you can take a few minutes to introduce yourselves and talk about which rubrics you did bring to talk about. Once you do that, you'll pick one person to present the rubric that you've either written, modified, or needs to be modified. So maybe you didn't get a chance to write one or modify one, and you just are bringing one that you already have. That'll also work. Go ahead to the next slide, Christy. So we're going to do the same sort of problem of practice protocol. Oh, your mouse took you back. And so we're going to have one person talk about, instead of a problem, their rubric that they want to talk about. Then we're going to analysis and do development and then do the implementation plan. It looks slightly different since we're talking about rubrics. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So we're going to use this problem of practice protocol, but around rubrics. So they're going to present an overview of the rubric that they've brought, still have the clarifying questions and the probing questions, and then they're going to discuss the rubric, analyze the rubric, and talk about improving the rubric. And they're going to summarize it on the slides that we've provided, and I'll go ahead and put a link to the slides back in the chat so that you can edit that next slide, and then we'll talk about it afterwards. If you go forward a slide so they can see where we're putting those. And we've only got 4 groups tonight, so I'll put you in groups of 4 so you can bring those in and discuss your rubrics and maybe get some good feedback on those. Let's go ahead and stop sharing for a minute so we can see everybody's faces. Are there any questions before I send you off into your breakout rooms? All right, I'm going to go ahead and send you off. Feel free to call us if you need us. I'm going to open the rooms up. If you need anything, let us know. I'll check in periodically through your time together, and then we'll call you back when it's time. All of the rubrics on it. Did you want me to share, or did you want to share, Christy? I can do either way. My mouse is not as sensitive as yours.
Okay, why don't you go ahead and do it then?
Okay.
Okay.
I'm going to leave this not in presentation mode for a moment because I want to make sure that people are still typing. Yeah, so there's some great comments here about the rubrics that people put together. I loved, there was a discussion I overheard part of in group 1 where they were talking about points versus rubrics, which I thought was really a fun discussion that I'm glad that I got to hear part of, about the pluses and minuses and why they were doing both and the interesting ways they were doing things in that district. I saw some great rubrics in all of the groups that were put up when I went by and visited. I don't even know if you guys all noticed it when I came by each time. I like that you've added in some of the different pieces around the different kinds of rubrics. The only thing that I wish I had requested is maybe you guys could have linked the rubrics in the chat, so you guys later in this slide, so that later you can look at each other's rubrics and maybe use them, since we're all science teachers on here. Does anybody want to, I'm going to give a minute. Does anybody want to unmute for a second and talk about this experience and what was good or bad about it for you, or what you got from it? Everybody's still frantically typing. Oh, thank you for linking the rubrics in there. And that way later, when people have a chance, they can go back and see those if they're doing a similar subject. So if other people would link their rubrics that they talked about, that would be fantastic. I'm going to go back to the slideshow mode so that we can move on. These are the books that Christy referenced on the various slides if you wanted them all in one place so that you don't have to go digging back through it. If you're interested in buying any of those rubrics or requesting them as PD from your departments. The link on there is for the slides from session 3, because we're in session 4 right now, and the recording from session 3 in case you didn't manage to get here last time. Those are there. And next time we'll have the link for the recording for this time as well. And next time we'll be meeting in January 24th from 4:30 to 6 p.m. We'll also be laying out in both Wild Apricot, and we'll let you guys know in January what those other dates are for February, March, April, May, and June, because we continue on through there, because we'll be doing the motivation January and February, and we'll continue on to those other topics from there. We've got an article linked here around motivation. And next time, it would be great if you brought a problem of practice around motivating students so we can talk about it in our groups. Please make sure to continue to complete the exit ticket before leaving. We'll drop that in the chat in just a minute if you aren't getting it from this live. And I'll go ahead and stop the recording at this time.